there is a new series of imprints out about Andy Warhol, on whom you are an authority as a person and as an icon. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about why that series is now coming out.
Well, I think that it's just, there's so many books about Warhol that have come out over the years, and because of the sort of the death of the book industry, or the death of the book as an artifact in bookstores and all that, it's a sad death. There's been a need to kind of go back into the archives and find these treasures. I'm thrilled that mine is among them. My book went out of print years ago. It came out in 2001. It was a labor of love. I'm very proud of it, and it just vanished. So did a book that was a real model for me, Stephen Koch's Stargazer, which was the first account of Warhol's cinema.
You are very interested in icons. I did have the good fortune to meet him. He came to Hong Kong in 1981, and I happened to interview him at that time. I have to say, Wayne Koestenbaum, he terrified me.
Because of his... was he unkind to you in any way?
No, not in the least. He was very polite. He actually said to me, early 80s, he said, all my friends are dying. All my friends are dying. That's all he kept saying. And, of course, at that time, we had no idea about AIDS.
Wow. How he was preoccupied by death. That is a really uncanny thing to hear, that he said to you almost in a social conversation. He didn't know you, and he's saying something so somber, grave, and profound. Wow. Well, he was, I never met him, which made it easier for me to write the book, because then I had no, it made it a purer experience of fantasy immersion to some extent for me. And also, I had never been a huge fan of his work. I respected it, but it didn't move me particularly, despite the Jackie Kennedys and the Liz Taylors and icons that a love for whom I shared with him. It wasn't really until I immersed myself in the story of his life, with its various shames and humiliations, and a rise from essentially poverty to the eminence that he achieved. I mean, it wasn't until I felt from within the wounded Andy that I understood how the sheen and brilliance of the surfaces of his work had some sort of a compensatory relationship to his sadness and shame.
And of course, it's no coincidence you mention humiliation, because your book, Humiliation, is in the Big Idea Small Book series. What does humiliation mean to you? And is that only in the queer context, using queer as a political term here?
I mean, I think it's certainly in Warhol's case, the queer part of it was huge, because he was, as he put it himself and others would have put it, very swish, as opposed to, I think, other gay artists of his milieu like Jasper Johns or Rauschenberg, who had a little bit more of a capability of seeming butch. And Andy was just, as he would have put it, Nelly. And plus he had these, he was interested in female glamour and drag queens, and it was tough for him to mainstream himself. So just to digress, is just to say that it's really extraordinary that he became identified with such all-American icons as Marilyn Monroe and the Coke bottle and the Campbell soup can, given what a kind of Nelly outsider he was to that culture. But I think his shame came also from poverty, or working class poverty, something like dyslexia, though I hesitate to use the term sloppily, but he certainly had a difficult relationship to conventional literacy.
In fact, he had an external manifestation that was a reason. It provided a reason for him to develop shame and humiliation, so that he could then turn that later on in some ways to celebrity.
You were that's so well put. It was actually his skin. He felt, at least, that he had damaged skin. I don't know how really damaged it was, but it was kind of blotchy. And he also had, at St. Vitus dance, when he was very young, a disease of affliction of uncontrolled movement. So that physically he was working within a body that felt it needed to control and cover itself. And I think you're absolutely right. His concern with screens and skin, beginning from his own shamed sense of his screen skin, transferred to a fascination with silver screens.
The idea of screens in his work was incredibly important to you.
Yeah, one concrete thing is his use of silk screens, which was his revolutionary contribution to contemporary American art. Rather than, though he had a very fine hand, as they say, and could draw marvelously, had a career as a fashion illustrator in a sense, before he became a fine artist, but he, rather than paint Marilyn Monroe, he took a media image of her and passed it through a silk screen, which distanced him from the representation, demanded the use of assistants, and both metaphorically and actually, it just changed the way we look at the painting. The sense of Marilyn's image has passed through some kind of a sieve or filter, distancing us from her, but also making legible her starriness.
So making her touchable, but isn't that also in some sense making a pastiche? Somehow people who were other, not real people.
It's a good point, but when I look at his work, say, again, just any of the celebrity portraits when they're rendered through that silkscreen process, I feel almost that I'm entitled to imagine the point of view of the person thus rendered. Specifically, seeing a Marilyn, I see and feel child Andy Warhol looking at Marilyn. I see Norma Jean Baker looking at herself transformed into Marilyn Monroe. It's somehow that though the silk screen registers quite accurately the media image, it blotches it up a little bit. It introduces random irregularities in the surface that seem kind of like poignant reminders of the mortality of the person behind the image. It's a very strange process whereby this making more artificial of a person's image somehow also brings out the vulnerability and tenderness of the real person behind it.
Now, you didn't know him, as you say, but did you know anybody from the factory, or did you have any tangential relationship with them?
My social life or upbringing or anything like that, but for the research for the book, I interviewed at least 30 people who knew Warhol, some of them very close associates. I interviewed his major studio assistant from the early 60s, Gerard Malanga, who made with Andy those famous silk screens. I interviewed Nathan Gluck, who was Warhol's major assistant in the 1950s when he was a commercial artist. I interviewed people who worked with him in the gallery world, Mary Boone, Pat Hearn, his associates like Vincent Fremont. I interviewed even the guy, Alan Midget, who was Andy Warhol's double, who went on a lecture tour in the 60s posing as Andy Warhol. Because Andy thought, well, this guy's better looking than I am, and so if he puts on an Andy Warhol wig, everybody will be happier to see him than to see me. So, and I interviewed Billy Name, who constructed the look of the Silver Factory and lit all of Andy's movies. I got a major taste of the milieu through these people who were kind enough to tell me their stories.
So when he died, did you feel that something had been lost to America, not just American mainstream, we've discussed it, he was also a mainstream icon, but had queer intellectualism lost somebody very significant?
I think that they had, and they didn't yet know it. And I think one of the functions of my biography coming out, again, in 2001, after his death, was a chance for queer intellectuals, let's call them, to catch up with the contributions Andy made during his life, contributions that were not unambivalently embraced by the so-called queer community. Because Andy took a turn toward what some saw as cultural conservatism when he hooked up with Bob Colacello and had Nancy Reagan on the cover of Interview and made became a business artist, as he put it himself. European intellectuals loved it because they understood that Warhol was somehow, in a weird way, performing a Marxist critique of capital, maybe. That's what they thought. But Americans, particularly American liberals and left-leaning people, didn't get what Andy was pulling with his infatuation with glamour and wealth. And so I think it was people of my generation, after Warhol's death, who were able to look at his work in toto, including the films, which are very queer, and had not been available for years to be seen, were able to look at the range of his achievement and see that he was, though not conventionally so literate or intellectual, was doing some serious thinking about male and female and in-between bodies in the 20th century.
He appreciated time and time capsules. And your own book now, this delayed republication, reprinting of the book, brings his work and through you to a whole new set of people. What kind of different interpretations do you think people would have now on your own work and on the man himself?
Well, I think that I'm so grateful to hear you put it that way. It's uncanny, these time capsules within time capsules, and that this notion that it takes sometimes a major lag in time for things to be heard and for resonances to emerge. I think it's widely understood now that Warhol was a kind of predictor of a lot of contemporary saturation with instant communication, instant self-commodification, anything from selfies and Twitter, reality TV shows, all of that Warhol was a pioneer of, both a celebrant of those practices and a critic of them. And so I think that the way that certainly younger people today take for granted a certain amount of agency that they can allow themselves with regard to their own image.
I was hoping to get through the entire interview without referring at all to that phrase, because that's the hackneyed, everybody's famous for 15 minutes.
Right, that one. Well, it's true.
He had an appreciation of the ephemeral nature of time, and therefore the celebrity that many thought he appreciated and therefore criticized him for was in fact his interpretation of the fact that it was nihilist, worthless.
Exactly. And somewhere beneath this is a religious sense. Not saying that, I'm not conventionally religious. I'm not sure Warhol was, so he went to church. But he was interested in aura and sacredness. And even though he may have gone down in history as the destroyer of aura, or so it seemed to more conservative artists of the time in the 60s when he came out with this scandalous pop work, in fact, he was into preserving aura and finding it in mysterious and maybe desecrated places.
Was he raised a Catholic? I thought he was. Isn't that right?
Yeah, he was raised a Catholic, and he went to church, I think, every week. And there are obvious connections in his work between, the iconography of the Virgin Mary and all that stuff. There's a Last Supper image in his work. I'm not saying that the Coke bottle is Christ exactly, but he was interested in icons and relics. His entire career is an exploration of what it means to worship an image, and that is a sensation and experience that exists on a religious register as well.
Now, what about the problem that I perceive, where some people who are not LGBTQ dismiss Warhol as just an LGBTQ icon?
That's funny. Call me naive or sheltered. That I don't know if I'd been aware of that. In fact, I guess I had always thought, well, everybody's liking Warhol, and it's my duty to reclaim or cast a spotlight on his queer aspects, lest he be too mainstream because of his love of Americana. But at least from my point of view, Warhol is a really consumable item on the American menu. And that unless you see his films, you could even forget that he was gay. that he did not do, he was not Robert Mapplethorpe. He didn't do that kind of stuff. He did not. There's some beefcake in his work, but he quickly moved from like Troy Donahue and Elvis and Marlon Brando to Warhol and Liz and others. And unless you're already pretty steeped in gay culture and imagery, you could miss the fact that he's looking at Marilyn and Liz and Jackie and et cetera, all down through Diane von Furstenberg, with a kind of queer eye. But I don't think that that's the first impression until you watch the films, and then you see, wow, there's just like a lot of naked guys walking around here.
And there's a whole aspect, we discussed his physical ailments, but also trauma. It was, as you say, the motor of his life. He was an afflicted man, not just physically. He was an afflicted and scarred man emotionally, and I would suggest sexually too. His sexual identity, while he was terribly popular, he was never very secure.
Yep. And he traveled very fluidly between worlds, and he was schooled, I think, from the fashion and ad industries in the 50s to understand that American fashion, for example, is a kind of a queer world, but it's also not. I mean, like, if you look at, like, just like the major, Calvin Klein, whatever that is, even Studio 54, yeah, it's gay, but it's also disco even. It's not. That's like American music, Michael Jackson. So Warhol isn't alone in being both an exemplary figure of American pop life and queer. The trauma thing, in a way we're all traumatized. It's kind of a basic human predicament, and some of us are more traumatized maybe than others, but I think you could say that Warhol was drawn to depicting scenes of shock and trauma, but at the same time giving them a sheen or shine so that we experience not just the degradation of the moment, but the freezing and the anesthesia that comes truly with shock and trauma.
And the shock and trauma, part of it must have been from the dawning realization that AIDS was, or HIV certainly, was creeping upon himself and people in the community that was still very afraid to be open at that time.
Yep, that is absolutely true. And it's also true that race riots in the civil rights movement and the assassination of JFK, or even scenes of poisoning, plane crashes. He would have had a field day with 9/11. Honestly, that's a Warhol-esque catastrophe. That kind of, just call it those kinds of events that hit people on both a private and a public level. Spectacular American catastrophes were his specialty.
I cannot let you just discuss Warhol, because as someone described you, I think it's the most magnificent description I've ever heard of anyone, that you're like an impossible love child from a late-night drunken three-way between Joan Didion, Roland Barthes, and Susan Sontag. I have never heard such a wonderful description of somebody. And why I raise this, because I think it's absolutely true. Your great love is in fact sound and opera, and we must talk about your book, The Queen's Throat, because it is your best-known book. It is highly regarded.
Thank you. Oh, that's so nice to hear all that. The person who said that thing about me being the love child of those three is Bruce Hanley, who's an amazing art critic, and I do love that line. I really am so grateful. I love those writers, and I love being thought of, first of all, as just a love child, which makes me feel like a supreme song. So opera, sound. I was a classical musician as a younger person, a pianist, and that close obsessive listening and control over the emission and the production of sound is a really basic part of my thinking about all art forms. I don't know quite where to even go with that, except that I don't listen to opera as much as it might seem that I would have. Like, I go to the opera a few times a year, but I'm not there every night. Whatever it is, whatever I learned from being a pianist and then from being an opera fan, a wish to take the sound that I hear and sublimate my entire self into that sound entering my ear. That propensity to surrender to art and to allow myself to be mesmerized by it, I took to the Warhol project. Warhol is not operatic, but I looked at Warhol paintings, for example, and films with that same posture of wishing to surrender myself to an experience that might be engulfing and might erase me and might shock me in some sense, but would dissolve myself.
But it is a highly sexualized experience in the response it brings out in the viewer.
Yes. And opera is a highly sexualized experience. I mean, it is the singer's voice is in your body as you listen. It is literally the vibrations are in you, and they're kinds of shiver and shudder and intake of breath. There's a whole repertoire of like infinitesimal physiological movements and tremors that happen when you listen to music. It's more obvious with pop music because you're dancing, for example. So like the aforementioned disco, it's kind of obvious that you're physically responding to the music.
You say that it's actually about masculinity. Now, opera isn't front and center anymore. You seem to suggest it should be.
Well, I think opera is one of the most intense things that civilization ever figured out to do with the human body. So I think that as in the same way that representational painting was like an amazing thing that the human animal figured out how to do, and that produced photography and movies, that whole thing is amazing. Call it representation. Similarly, voice, that you could train a voice and have it behave like an instrument. And make it do those things acoustically without amplification, and that you could also tell stories via that sound. That's something that is really extraordinary. It kind of goes back to Greek tragedy, which was sung, and then they figured out in the Renaissance that they were going to rediscover Greek tragedy and do this wild game called opera. And they did it for a few centuries, and then it seemed to kind of run out of steam, largely because I think of I call it amplification arrived, or just different kinds of sound production, a certain happy democratization of sound emissions. But I guess I'm saying I'm not demanding that opera be front and center. It is awfully expensive, and people can get their thrills anywhere they want. They don't have to go to opera. They really can't. But while we're at it, let's just say 3 cheers for those freaky things that those Europeans figured out how to do with the human voice.
And you had this wonderful web series. It was called The Mother of All Book Trailers. Dear Wayne, I've been humiliated. And I'd love people to go and Google it and read it. But I do have to talk to you about hotel theory, because you wrote a book, a discussion about the meaning of hotel life and what it means. I love that idea, because people check into hotels without a thought, but it does have an effect on people.
I was interested in I call it hotel consciousness, or being in hotel, where you leave your life and you check in somewhere seeking anonymity. And it's a kind of, you could call it like a Warhol fantasy, like the Chelsea Hotel, or even stardom. Superstardom is a way of checking out of regular existence and just becoming an imaginary Liz Taylor, which is what Candy Darling did. So I guess I wanted to figure out what in a way the afterlife of a career might be, when instead of imagining that it's sort of a pathetic denouement, imagining it as a kind of weird, chill rest cure in an SRO. I don't know. Maybe it goes back to my interest in anesthesia, or losing myself by surrendering. Hotels seem to me a really handy metaphor for a way that we can happily, sometimes, and temporarily give up our identities.
So it's animated suspension.
It's just exile. It's a form of easy exile via Holiday Inn. This is a kind of a romantic fiction. I don't think it's so actually so pleasant to stay in most hotels. It's lonely and weird and cold, but again, back to maybe trauma. It's like that silkscreen image. It's not filled with warmth and identity and happiness and good conversation. It's almost posthumous. And there's something starry about that exile into the glacial that I think of as hotel consciousness.
I'm going to take the interviewer's prerogative and brush over the anatomy of Harpo Marx, not because I don't think it's worthy of discussion, but because Joe Queenan annoyed me. He seemed to take the view that you looked at Harpo Marx only from a prurient sense of just throwing in four-letter anatomy words, but I recommend people take a look at the anatomy of Harpo Marx. What I want to spend the last few minutes on is your poetry. The simplicity looks simple, but it isn't.
Wow, that's so gratifying to hear you mention poetry, because usually in most times when I'm interviewed or anything, the discussion is about the more splendid public things I write about, like Jackie Kennedy or Harpo Marx, et cetera. And poetry is, in a way, more of a private or a secret art, but it's the origin of the way I write, even when I write in prose. And it has to do, in a way, with writing like a musician. It doesn't mean I always rhyme, or certainly, my prose can also be plain spoken, but it means that I listen to language as it appears to my imagination and as it falls on the page, and I weigh it and judge it according to its rhythm and its sound. And that's a kind of an instinct. It's not an evasion of other ways of looking at language. It's a primary way that I function as a writer, is sonically and tasting the words a bit. And so even the way I revise my prose isn't the way a lot of prose writers revise. I read the sentence out loud. I look at it in isolation. I anatomize it. So poetry is my first art. I mean, it's the basic art. It's what I write when it's the urge to write in itself. It's not prose. I write to some extent always as a task. It's a voluptuous task, but it's a task, and it's because somebody wants to hear about a certain subject. Poetry is what I write because I'm a human being who exists in language.
You haven't had a poetry book out for a couple of years. You have about half a dozen volumes of poetry out. You must be due to have a new one out quite soon.
So, you are so kind, and you didn't even get that prompted. I have a book of poetry coming out in October. It's called The Pink Trance Notebooks, which is a series of 34 assemblages crafted from a series of notebooks I kept in the year 2013 in various states of, I'd like to think of as trance.
Because
in trance, because I wanted to go into hotel consciousness. I wanted to flee the usual Wayne that writes. And so I experimented with a lot of procedures for loosening my voice and relaxing vigilance to produce kinds of new floods of language from which I could cull these little assemblages that are more intimate, more ragged, dirtier in a sense, but maybe even also more erudite than my poetry has usually been. A wider range of language, more saltiness, more truth.
It's very clear that a lot of your immediate impetus to commit words to paper or to create some sort of prose comes from an oral, A-U-R-A-L, stimulus. I do want to ask you, and I should have asked you earlier, about the Jackie O libretto. We've discussed your opera. We've discussed the icons you like in your life. I feel you must be going to soon do another opera libretto.
Well, I would really love to. That was a lot of fun to do the Jackie O opera with Michael Dougherty. I have written, I actually am in the midst of writing an opera with a young composer, Mohamed Fairouz, Fairouz. It's called Pierrot. It was originally done as a song cycle for a solo voice and 5 instruments, and it was called audaciously Pierrot Lunaire, after the Schoenberg cycle.
No little ambition taking on Schoenberg.
No little ambition. And that was one. And now we've kind of expanded it into an opera, and now we're just calling it Pierrot, so there will be no confusion with Pierrot Lunaire. And that would be that's like a one-man show, and it's in development, and it should come out pretty soon. I recently published a book of essays, My 1980s and Other Essays, which has sort of serious essays on Sontag and Barthes and figures like that, the poet James Schuyler. And so I think I actually really would like to write an advice book. I don't think that's necessarily serious criticism, but as a kind of offshoot of my humiliation videos. I like giving advice.
Well, Wayne Koestenbaum, you're an absolute delight. I could talk to you for a great deal longer. Thank you very much again. This interview was prompted, I'm very happy to say, by the reprint of Wayne Koestenbaum's work on Warhol, which was published well over a decade ago and is now out. Thank you very much for talking to us, and I hope you'll come back again.
Terrific. Okay, thank you. Bye.